you. Good morning. Good morning to you. Ooh, good morning. Good morning to you. Ooh, good morning. Good morning. Good morning to you. Oh, oh, good morning. Good morning. Good morning to you. Well, that was my old school version of Good Morning this morning. I hope that everybody is having a great and wonderful morning. This is Daring Dialogues, and I'm your host, Shantae Charles. I hope that everybody is doing well, that you're doing well, both body, soul, and spirit. And today is Teachable Tuesday if you're with us for the first time. I have been trying to keep up on people who are following me. Good morning, Taylor May. Glad to see that you are in with us today. I've been trying to keep up with those who've been following me. So if I'm not getting your follow request and you're an actual real person and not a digital bot, you can email me at reachshante@gmail.com. Let me know your your username on Periscope, and I will find you and I will follow you back. All right. I've had to do a lot of dumping because of the digital bots. So I want to make sure that we are talking and communicating with real people. If you've been following the show, you know that every day of the week we cover something different. So Mondays is motivation, Tuesdays is Teachable Tuesday, where we cover Black history and things that concern us as Black people, African Americans, people of descendants of the enslaved. And then Wednesday, we cover relationships. And right now, we're studying the history of dating and its implications for singles. And then Thursday is Theology Thursday. Right now, we're talking about how Christianity was actually originated in Africa, and we're talking about the seedbed of Christianity and how it moved from Africa over to the West, and how did the West get influenced by this African faith. Because many people think it's European, when in fact it's actually an African faith and it has been hijacked by the West. All right. And so, of course, when anytime something gets hijacked, it never really finds all of its true purpose in whoever hijacked it. So that's why we're trying to go back to the beginning. Fridays is healthy, wealthy, and wise. And right now, we're talking about your score, talking about credit scores. Most of us by now, if you've been studying with us, recognize that the credit score industry really is a game, and you have to know how to play the game in order to get the good credit, in order to, if you want to use that system of credit as opposed to something else, you have to know what the game is and how to play it. All right. And then, of course, we're also looking at right now well, the foods that have been considered bad for you and what the research actually shows. And we're learning a little bit about that. So we just finished up talking last week about butter and milk. And this Friday, we're going to be talking about meat and meat products. Okay? All right. So back to today. We are in Dr. Claude Anderson's book, A Black History Reader, 101 Questions You Never Thought to Ask. And we're going to go back to this intensive book today, Everything You Love Will Burn, inside the rebirth of the white nationalism in America. And it's a subject that, people don't necessarily want to deal with or want to talk about, but we have to talk about it because it is directly affecting the lives of Black Americans. So, I'll figure out which chapter we're going to cover today because we're not going in a straight line. I want to say good morning, Lady Barbara. Good morning, Mr. Taylor. Good morning, Pastor Ben. Good morning, Lady Ravonda. Good morning, Lady Judy. All right. So this is where we are today. So I'll figure out once we get there, I'll figure out which chapter we're going to cover today. All right. So in Dr. Claude Anderson's book, we have been looking at the section entitled Historical Ironies. Historical Ironies. And the last thing we covered, we talked about why isn't the white Americans, why aren't white Americans marching for their rights? And it is because, as we summarized last time, it is because their rights are pretty much covered under the original document, under the Constitution. So when you see white people out marching, they're really marching for the rights of others people. Okay? And if you see white supremacists out marching saying white lives matter and they're marching for their rights, they're not marching for their rights. Okay? They're marching for the right to dominate other people, which is different from marching for your basic civil human rights. Okay? All right. So that's the difference. They're saying they want what they call a white ethno state, meaning that they either want to get rid of people of color in this country by genocide. And these aren't my words. These are the actual centers that study hate groups. This is what they said. They actually want to either get rid of people of color either by genocide or by expulsion from the country, which is why those who carry these views, you see them in seats of power trying to help enact laws and enact policies that will indeed and in fact expel people of color, right? Remember, they said initially, number 45 initially said, I'm only going after the quote unquote illegal aliens, when in reality, no human being is illegal. But anyway, the language that they use. So he initially said, I'm only going after the illegal people in this country. Now he's going after legal people. He's going after people who legitimately follow the process to become a citizen in the United States. Just a couple of weeks back, there was an article released about how I believe people of Hispanic descent, right, or people of Latin descent, more correctly termed, they are getting their passports revoked, and they're U.S. citizens. And some of them are being told, if you leave this country on this passport and try to come back, you will not be able to get back in. All right, so this is concerning, or it should be concerning to all of us. We're going to look at question 26 from his book today, which is it possible for resource-rich Black Africa to become a world superpower? This is a huge discussion that's happening right now in the world. If you've been paying attention to what's happening in Africa with China, you know there's a couple of things happening. China is moving into certain countries. I want to say Zambia is one. Gabon is another. They're moving into certain countries and making these trade deals with their leaders. And then they are now exploiting the land, all right? They're extracting resources. They're also utilizing the human resource of Africans in those countries. But the other part of that is they are treating those that they are working, all right, almost like slaves. Several videos have come out recently where it shows that the Chinese are beating the Africans with canes. So that's causing some outrage, of course. And then also they're doing what people would say, they're creating anchor babies. What does that term mean? It means that many of the laws in African countries prohibit people who are not African from obtaining the resources of the land. So we know in the past in colonization, they would just kill off people to take the land. But now what the Chinese are doing is they're encouraging their men who are being sent over, they're encouraging their men to cohabitate and to procreate with the African women so they can have children with them. And if you want to talk about fatherlessness, my God, these Chinese men, a lot of them are leaving the women and the children, leaving the children fatherless. All right. So now you have an African Chinese baby with no dad, but they're doing it in order to be able to have future rights to the land because now they have a child of Africa, and now that ties them to the land and to the rights or some of the rights to the land. It also enables them to have a child that they could possibly raise up in the future that will sit in seats of power that can even change the laws to be more favorable to China and China's trade agenda. So again, while some of Africa is playing checkers, the Chinese are playing chess. Okay? So we have to understand this. And a lot of times when people look at things like marriage, many of us have been taught and have been trained to only look at marriage in terms of, I love this person, they love me, let's get married. Whereas other cultures see marriage as a covenant and a business transaction. They see the business side of marriage. All right. They see the generational lineage wealth building side of marriage. So this is what the Chinese have been tapping into. So let's get into it. Let's see what Dr. Claude Anderson has to say to maybe fill in some of the data gaps for us today. Is it possible for resource-rich Black Africa to become a world superpower? Even though time is running out, Black Africa could become a world superpower if they rise above tribalism, religious differences, and the impact of the Berlin Conference, which happened from 1884 and 1885, in which European colonial powers identified and took control of the parts of Africa they wanted and colonized the entire continent. So that was the original colonization plan. All right. Africa is the richest continent on this earth. It is on the verge of economic recolonization, or what I'd like to call colonization 3.0. Unfortunately, European powers have been draining the continent of its vital resources for centuries, and now countries from around the world are competing with Europeans to capture and export resources out of Africa. For 50 years, Black Africans have been visible in political leadership of African nations, but they are not in control of their nations' economies. European powers engage African politicians in practicing what we call comparative economics instead of competitive economics. In comparative economics, African countries would bring raw materials to the marketplace and sell them to European corporations in order for them to be processed. Using comparative economics, Europeans process the raw materials, then transform those products into goods, which they then sell back to African countries at a price quadruple of what they paid for the raw materials. This trading practice leaves a balance of trade deficit that African nations cannot close unless they begin to borrow money from the World Bank or the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund. This pushes those countries further into debt. Using competitive economics, African countries would keep their raw materials, manufacture consumer products, sell them to European and or other nations, retain the profits and wealth, and thereby prosper socioeconomically within the African continent. So, in the first model, right, they're pretty much what many people would call it as almost like a global sharecropping that is happening on the continent. The same thing that happened in sharecropping in the United States, where black people were trying to produce goods, right, and they were trying to earn money so that they could have enough money to get out of the plantation system. When in fact, the plantation owner, by the end of that year, say, when he went to calculate, and I put that in huge quotations, because in his calculations, he always came out on top, and the sharecropper always came out on the bottom. So when he would calculate, he would say, okay, this is what I'm going to take out for your supplies. This is what I'm going to take out for the new boots you needed. This is what I'm going to take out for the food that you ate and all of this. And by the time that the sharecropper got done, they were in further debt to the plantation owner. So they just kept working and working and working, incurring debt that they could never pay off. This is what is similarly happening in Africa, just on a larger scale. All right? Because if you're in debt and you borrow from the IMF and you create more debt, and you're going to have to keep borrowing from the IMF, so it becomes a cycle. In recent years, African countries have been overrun by countries like China, Japan, and India, which are all in search of raw materials to supply their country's consumer demands. These countries insert their people into the native African populations to specifically capture material resources and consumers and build influence within African governments. They also exploit the people of Africa, destroy the continent's wildlife, and deplete its natural resources. China is an example. It invests heavily in the infrastructure of African countries in exchange for an open door access and control of Africa's numerous resources. China wields great influence in South Africa in particular. The newly approved South African National Constitution contains an affirmative action provision that grants, listen, preferential treatment for Chinese residents of South Africa, but does not allow preferential treatment for the nation's approximately 45 million African blacks, which I believe their new leader, Malema, can't think of his first name, Mr. Malema is now trying to change that. All right, he's trying to balance the economics in South Africa, and people are fighting him on it. African blacks make up about 79% of the nation's population, but own and control less than 1% of the nation's wealth, income, and management positions. Sounds like America. Why would black political figureheads knowingly approve a national constitution that denies preferential treatment to the actual impoverished majority of the black population? Nearly all of the major businesses and industries throughout Africa are owned and controlled by non-black people. Blacks in Africa are like blacks in America in many respects. They are consumers and not producers. Not saying that we cannot produce. Let me clarify that. All right. We can produce, but the problem becomes access to capital, right? Access to the materials that we need in order to build and rebuild our institutional structures. Because we knew that in the 1900s, black people were producing their own materials and goods and not just buying everyone else's. So now it becomes an issue of and a challenge of how do we get back to the place of being more so known as producers than we are known as consumers. Everybody knows we are consumers. Hello, Nike. Why do we think Nike stock went up? Nike stock went up not because black people were producing Nikes. Nike stock went up because black people said, if he's on the side of Colin Kaepernick, then so are we. going to be on the side of Nike. And they went out and they bought more product. They didn't create more, they bought more. All right. So the business owners who are smart and recognize that the largest group of consumers in the United States, especially, is Black people, would know not to alienate the largest consumer base in America, which is Black people. This is not rocket science. All right. And if you want your business to go out of business or to struggle, then go ahead and alienate Black people as the number one consumers in the United States and see what happens. Hello, Papa John's, who's going to have to, I think the number is, he's looking at closing 250 stores nationwide. Okay. While non-Blacks are migrating into Africa to build businesses that produce wealth and power for their countries, African Blacks are distracted by internal fights based upon tribal or religious identification. Every month, thousands of African Blacks perish due to lack of food, water, medicine, or war-related conflicts. Within a few years, foreigners will take control of the resources on the African continent, and African Blacks will be locked into a permanent underclass, the same thing that is looming for American Blacks. Colonization of Africa allowed Europeans to control the enormous wealth from Africa's resources. Later, as the Black Civil Rights Movement was underway in the U.S., white colonial powers in Africa reluctantly began to surrender their open control of governments and political leadership to African Blacks. Just as they had done in other nations as they exited, however, because they're always playing chess and not checkers, white colonial powers established puppet leaders in the high levels of government. By continuing to own and control the business, industries, and resources in every African nation, whites were able to continue to control the nations from their distant lands. And so much of what we saw in the last, I would say, 40 to 50 years is you saw people and citizens trying to overthrow these puppet leaders. Wherever there was a puppet leader, the citizens were trying to overthrow them. And wherever there wasn't a puppet leader who actually cared for their people, the U.S. and other countries teamed up and they sent out what is called, and you can actually, there's some documentaries on this on YouTube. You can actually, they went out and they colluded together to say this leader is not going to be in the best interest of all of these other countries who want to exploit their particular nation. So what they did was they teamed up and they sent out people called economic hitmen. Economic hitmen are designed to go in and to destabilize a country, to overthrow a African ruler or any other ruler, really, to overthrow a ruler that is not going to be in the best interest of foreign nations exploiting a country. So they send in an economic hitman. That economic hitman stirs up the people. They help to stir dissension. They help to turn the citizenry against the person that was really for them. And then they overthrow the government from the inside out. All right. I believe in many ways that is what is happening to America right now in reverse. We have participated in doing that to so many other countries that we don't see that similar things are now happening in our nation. That there have been economic hitmen sent in to destabilize America, to get Americans fighting each other, to put in a puppet leader who will do what other foreign nations want done to America, which is to destabilize us so that we can be overthrown as a country. And there are some people who are falling for it. And they're falling for this puppet leader They're idolizing a puppet leader whose interest is not even in the interest of your own country and your own freedom. If you just look at the policies that he is putting forth, you will see that. And so now we have people who are working behind the scenes who have woken up to the fact that this person is actually trying to overthrow our government and the rule of law. And now they're trying to minimize the damage that he is doing because we're still in a democratic republic. We're not in a dictatorship. So they're trying to minimize the damage that he is inflicting, but the reality is he is inflicting damage that is going to take several generations to undo. All right? So these white colonial powers, they establish puppet leaders in the high levels of government. By continuing to own and control the business, the industries, and resources in every African nation, whites were able to continue this control from a distant land. Good morning, love. Like blacks in the United States, strength would come with greater African black unity. Modern Africa could become a superpower if the individual political states could demonstrate a mutual transcontinental self-interest and organize to act as a single social and economic bloc that began to close its borders to non-black international exploiters. And that is kind of what is happening right now, or the beginning stages of that, with Mr. Malema in South Africa. I watched a brief interview where he began to talk about how they are trying to fix what has been done by Mandela's administration. And the gentleman was continuing to badger him to say, well, what about the agreements that Mandela made? What about the agreements Mandela made? What about the trade agreements that Mandela made with the colonial powers? And he specifically said, and he was very adamant about it, he said, this is not Mandela's administration. He said, we're not doing what Mandela did in the past. We're moving forward. We're moving on. He said, we're not obligated to stand by what Mandela told you all. We're going to do what's in the best interest of black South Africans. And it really kind of just shut the guy up. But you saw the pushback in the interview that they want to continue what benefits other people. Meanwhile, the black South Africans are living in poverty, and they should not be. All right? Like blacks in the United States, again, the strength would come with greater African black unity. A number of efforts are currently underway to do just that and to reverse the effects of the 1885 Berlin Conference. The continent of Africa can no longer afford to be divided while their continent is plundered by foreign political interests. For nearly 130 years, the nations of Africa have been divided, and within each African country, there are hundreds of tribes and languages. In Nigeria, for instance, there are over 200 tribes and 256 different spoken languages. Once the various African nations achieve their degree of unity along social and economic lines, they will then be able to connect with people of African descent around the world, and they would have to be recognized as an international superpower. When Africa is acknowledged as a superpower, respect and power for blacks in America will increase. The fate of blacks in Africa and the United States are linked in a way that has the potential to guide and uplift blacks throughout the diaspora. And so, again, what are they saying? Someone asked a very good question, and they said, well, why don't black Americans make their own exodus over to Africa and use their skill, their talent, their education, their resourcefulness that they have learned in the Americas? Why don't they just take it to Africa and help Africa rebuild? That's a very good question. Well, you have several camps. You have the Black Americans who know and understand that America is just as much theirs as it is anyone else's because their ancestors built this joint, literally. And then you have Black Americans who understand that not all of us came over here on ships. Some of our ancestors were already here. So it's our this land again is very much our land. And then you have the camp of Black Americans who say, yes, let's go over to Africa and let's help them build. But here's what all three of those camps are not understanding about America. America is built on the backs of our ancestors. America also, whether you know it or not, has registered every living soul as a stock and a bond on the stock market. Maybe some of y'all didn't know that. You know your birth certificate and your social security card? Those are actually registered on the stock market as a stock and a bond. Yeah. So every individual soul in America does count as a stock and a bond. Not the way that it used to in the past, but you are still considered a stock and a bond of this nation. What does that mean though? It means that let's say there's only 42 million of us in this country. Let's say 20 million of us decided that, hey, we want to go home. We want to go back to the motherland. As much as America says go back to Africa, if we actually did that, the stock market would have some serious problems. Because not only are you a stock and a bond, but everything, all of the resources that you create and out of all of the consumerism that you bring to the nation, all of that would be pulled out and it would be sent to Africa. So as much as people say we wish you back to Africa, the reality is we are all intricately tied into the system of the stock market. So it's not that easy for them to extricate us from the market. All right. So when people say stuff like that to me, I'm like, oh, you want me to go back? Exactly. So they really don't want us to go. Think about it. Why did Jim Crow go on? Why did sharecropping go on? Why do we have the prison industrial complex? Right? They could have just sentenced Black people to death, but that doesn't help the economy. So I'm not going to sentence you to death. I'm just going to give you an eternal slave sentence in prison. And then I'm going to work you picking cotton for 4 cents an hour because, yes, milk for life. It would bankrupt the nation. So we have to think about the fact that we have to remember Black people were the cash, the capital, and the credit for this nation. Originally, it was just Black people. All right. But I believe in the 1930s, because of what happened with our money, the system changed. And now literally everybody is a stock and a bond. They just don't know it. Or maybe they haven't figured it out yet. All right. So what happens when your human capital is literally now stock and bonds? Well, we're praying that this doesn't happen, but look at China. China owns most of the debt of the United States. We talk big and bad about China, but the reality is if China called in their debts, the United States would not be able to pay it. And therefore, if the United States cannot pay it, then what do you think is going to happen to the human capital in the United States to pay off its debt? They're going to start with, and that notice I said start. They would start with, exactly, and that's already happening. I researched it. They're going to start with prisoners. Why? Because under the 13th Amendment, prisoners are already legal slaves. Their rights have already been stripped. So if I have to pay debt to China, I'm going to start by giving you the people that are already in my economy that are counted as human resource legal slaves already. I'm going to start there. And then when I move from that place, okay, when I move from that place, now, okay, if I give you all of my slave resource that I've already garnered through prison industrial complex, who's going to be next in line to be shipped off? Well, it might be the homeless, right? Because you feel like they're not productive in society. The homeless, the jobless, they might be next. The welfare recipients. All right. So it just goes down the line with the human capital. But people are not talking about this. History is repeating itself. You're right. People are not talking about this, I think, because it can bring nightmares as to how deep this particular rabbit hole goes. But the reality is, people say, the United States is the greatest superpower on earth. Well, we are until China calls in our debt. I'm just saying. So just keep that in mind as believers, if you're a believer, and live ready. So when people are looking at our society right now and they're wondering, why are they trying to criminalize everything all of a sudden? Why are they trying to make homelessness criminal? Why are they trying to make this criminal over here? You used to be able to do this and it wasn't a criminal offense, or it wasn't a felony attached to it. And now all of a sudden it's a felony attached to it. I think they just did something recently with welfare. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but now it's like a criminal offense. They're going to go after people for a criminal charge. Why are they criminalizing human behaviors and mistakes? It's a difference between a civil offense and a criminal offense. Criminal offense, felonies means legal slavery. All right? Legal slavery. So, let me move on to my next question here. I don't think we're going to get to the other book today. I don't think we're going to get to it. All right. Question 28. Was Washington, D.C. ever both a slave capital and the nation's capital? My husband will tell you about our experience going to the Capitol and being in the Capitol Rotunda and feeling very, very eerie about it. But my husband actually heard some sounds while we were there and they were doing the Capitol tour. And he actually asked another guy, a Black American who was standing there with us in the tour, and he was like, "Do you hear that?" And the other guy heard it too. Because if you go to the Capitol Rotunda, you'll see that all of the pictures on the wall are supposed to be representative of different scenes in American history. He said, "Yes, I heard the screams of slaves." But no, there is no representation of the slaves who built the Capitol on the walls. Zero. It's like they didn't even exist in the history of the country. It's really eerie if you go in there. There's an Indian on the wall striking a deal in one of the paintings, probably representing one of the treaties that they struck with the government that was not fully honored. But there are no Black people on the walls. So when you talk about going into a space knowing that your ancestors built it and there's nothing on the wall that showed that your ancestors was even there, but you want us to stand for the flag though. All right. The District of Columbia, situated between Maryland and Virginia, has been a showplace of federal government institutions, business enterprises, and tourism throughout its history. But most notably, before the Civil War, Washington, D.C. was the mistress of the enslavement industry, with its main street studded with slave showrooms, slave depots, and approximately 200 slave auction marts. It earned the title of being the nation's slave capital. It was the home of the most notorious and lucrative slave auction houses in the country. On a typical day, there were continuous parades of chained men, women, and children being moved in the streets in funeral like processions from one auction house to another. The slaves were held in pens and dungeons until they could be safely sold down the river into the deep south. The same thing with Wall Street. Right at Wall Street, there was a slave auction there, a slave market right there in Wall Street. And underneath Wall Street, there are still dungeons for where they held the slaves. So literally, think about that. The center of finance and commerce in America, Wall Street, is literally built on top of the slave market and the slave dungeons. This is why, again, the history of this country is inextricably tied to how it makes its money. Here is one of the drawings I'm about to show you. It's Robbie's Pen Auction House, Washington, D.C. This comes from the U.S. Library of Congress. All right. They were drawing these things like it was cool. I mean, human trafficking, human flesh on sale in Washington, D.C. And again, you're up here shouting and railing about the flag, but you refuse to address the bedrock of our nation. Okay? Washington, D.C. as the nation's capital was distinctive because it was the destination of both enslaved and free blacks. However, free black persons living near or in the city were at risk of being kidnapped and sold back into slavery, which is what happened in the movie 12 Years a Slave. That's what happened to him. He was a free black who was captured, kidnapped, and sold back into slavery in the South. So even if you were a free black person, you didn't really want to hang around too much around the slave black people. Yeah, 2018, same mindsets. Anyway, you didn't want to hang around too much with the enslaved black people because you could be mistaken for an enslaved black person, even though you had on your nice new suit and your top hat and your cane. You could be re-enslaved yourself. Think about that. Many reminders of the city's role in slavery still exist. One of the biggest and most famous auction houses in the city was Robbie's Pen Auction House, located near the U.S. Capitol. Its location was convenient for slaveholders who also worked as government officials. Now think about that. Slaveholders who work as government officials who find out that people want to end slavery. Let's see if that would go over well. No. They wanted to be able to move back and forth easily between the Capitol debates and the slave auctions that were being held on the Capitol steps. So while you're debating about men's freedom and rights, you go from the Capitol and you walk right over to the slave block and you pick up some more slaves like you pick up your groceries on the way home. While you're debating about freedom, you're yet violating people's freedoms and selling them as human goods. This is the hypocrisy in which our nation was based on that we must deal with. Okay? With the auction houses close to the seat of national government, the slaveholders could run the country and their slave plantations simultaneously. 13, listen, 13 of the first 18 presidents were slave owners. But you worship them though. You worship your ancestors. It tickles me when people talk about Africa and Africans, and they talk about, oh, they're worshiping their ancestors. They're pouring out libations. You're doing the same thing. Hello? What do you think these monuments represent? It's ancestor worship. The Lincoln Memorial, the memorials that you see of Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin. Listen, that's a form of ancestor worship. How do I know that? Because these people will try to run you over with a car if you move their monuments. Okay? That's how I know. 13 of the nation's first 18 presidents were slave owners. Following the Revolutionary War, so were all the members of the U.S. Supreme Court were slave owners following the Revolutionary War. Most of the members of Congress were slave owners. When he was a member of Congress, Abraham Lincoln commented on how close Robbie's Pen auction house was to the Capitol and congressional offices. American slavery and government were the lifeblood of the District of Columbia and the nation. The race that held the slaves and whips 360 years ago holds the reins of power in government still to today. So, I don't know about you, but I look forward to a transfer of power November 6th, 2018. I don't know about you, but I look forward to God flipping our nation from being that of slave-holding members to those whose ancestors who had been enslaved. I don't think people get that. I don't think people really understand that there is a flipping going down. That the same people who held the reins of power and their generations who owned slaves, that come November, a lot of those seats are going to go to the ancestors of the people that your ancestors owned. I would say that's a divine reversal. I don't think people are looking too deeply into that, but it's a divine reversal. All right, I think we have time for one more question. I'll do question 31 since it ties into this. What role did Black slaves play in building the U.S. Capitol? Black people were the backbone of labor in America and built both the White House and the U.S. Capitol buildings. They also built everything from plantation mansions, which, in case you didn't know, several of them are burning down of their own accord and by natural disaster. 2 in South Carolina. One was struck by lightning, burnt down. The other one, I think, had an electrical issue and burnt down. I think God is trying to tell us something. They also built everything from plantation mansions to government buildings to university campuses. Atop the dome of the Capitol stands the Statue of Freedom in the figure of a female warrior dressed in a star-festooned helmet and flowing robes. Jefferson Davis, Secretary of War, during President Pierce's administration oversaw construction. He opposed the design of a woman wearing a French Revolutionary's Liberty cap. Secretary Davis was concerned that the Liberty cap, he was concerned that the Liberty cap on this statue might inspire the slaves, many of who built the Capitol, to seek freedom and revolt. Now listen here. Listen here. This man, this evil demon inspired man, was wise enough to understand if we put a symbol of liberty on the top of this, it's going to inspire the slaves to desire freedom and revolt. But monuments and statues don't really mean anything. Who are we fooling? Davis wanted a statue of freedom on top of the Capitol dome that symbolized freedom for everyone except Black people. The French Liberty cap is now on the freedom statue today. How are you going to put up a French Liberty freedom statue and take her cap off and refuse to put her cap on because you didn't want freedom for everyone? Wow. The statue was designed for $3,000 by Thomas Crawford in Rome, Italy in 1856. In 1863, it was cast in bronze at Bladensburg, Maryland, at a foundry owned by Clark Mills, whom the government paid $23,736. Philip Reed, a slave owned by Mills, was given the responsibility of casting the Statue of Freedom and transporting it in sections to the east grounds on the nation's capital. Once the sections arrived, Reed and other slaves assembled Freedom to make certain that all of her pieces fit together. Assembling Freedom took 31 days. Thus, the Statue of Freedom was disassembled, hoisted, and reassembled by slaves who did not have their freedom. These slaves hoisted the statue onto a pedestal in the Capitol dome so that she could signal freedom for everyone. This is the historical drawing of Black slaves building the Capitol building, U.S. Library of Congress. Again, if you notice, the U.S. Library of Congress contains lots of images that show the history of slavery and slaves and their connection to building this nation. But you have to go to the U.S. Library of Congress in order to see these images. Lady Judy, can you see it now? You had to wait till the comments expired. Can you see it now? All right. So America's own record really tells the story as to who was building this nation. It tells the story. We can deny it all we want, but the record is there. In 1863, the white superintendent in charge of building the nation's Capitol building quit, complaining that $8 per day was too little money for him. He was replaced by Philip Reed, the slave, who was responsible for casting the Statue of Freedom. He supervised the construction. Reed was just one of hundreds of Black slaves and freedmen who helped build the U.S. Capitol, the White House, and other monuments, including the Statue of Liberty. Like most slaves, Reed received no money, no praise, no plaudits, and no plaques. Clark Mills, Reed's owner, was paid for Reed's labor. Later on, European laborers and mechanics were imported to assist in the construction. They were paid market wages. When the work of the slaves was done, the U.S. Department of Treasury paid the white people who owned the slave laborers. So you know what? If I knew that one of my ancestors took part in building the Capitol and I had proof, oh, I would be at the Capitol right now demanding whatever you paid the slave owners, because we know that's on record, whatever you paid them, I need you to add interest and hand it over so I could put it in a trust for my future generations. Thank you. When the work of the slaves was done, they paid the whites who owned the slave laborers. Archive volunteers recently examined the construction and pay records and compiled a list of Capitol workers. They found 122 exactly, plus interest. They found 122 Negro hires referenced by their first names. Although most of the slaves were common laborers, the archive researchers were surprised to find the names of black stone cutters, carpenters, and painters. Slavery had produced an artisan class that worked on the Capitol building as well as in private construction projects. Now that's all nice and good and well and handy dandy, but if you have a first name and a last name, I need you all to finish the research, go track down their relatives, go track down their descendants, and get them paid. That's all I'm saying. Track them down, make some things right, and get them paid. Listen, I'm going to stop there for today. This has been another episode of Daring Dialogues, and I have been your host, Shantae Charles. I hope that you got something out of today. I hope that I made you think. I hope that you will go and do some of the research. Go and take a look at the history of the Capitol, the building as well. Next week, we're going to start here. Everything You Love Will Burn. For those of you who are new, you can actually find this in your library. So if you want to read along with us, you can. This reporter spent 6 years with the white nationalists who were planning their comeback. So it goes, he's going through and he's talking about the different white supremacist groups that are out there. In this book, he also shared that they are still hunting black people. There's been several incidences, as we close, there's been several incidences recently, I know in Louisiana for a fact, of 2 random shootings where a white male went into the hood and started randomly shooting black people. He was caught and he was arrested. All right. But these people, as he has evidenced in this book, this came out 2018, this year. He is evidenced in this book where he records the Klansmen talking about how they were going to go to Baltimore to go hunting for black people and shooting them up or shooting at them. So when you look and you hear the data on the news talking about such and such number of shootings in one weekend, Chicago's deadliest, da 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 da, you better wake up and recognize not that black people are not killing each other like that. We don't have that kind of gun power. We just don't. Even the drug dealers don't have that much artillery. All right? Understand what is happening. There are people who are trying to take down and take out Black America, black and brown people, because they fear the browning of this nation. And the more fear that is being instilled in them through media and through deception and through fear, the more of this stuff you will start to see, because people are operating out of fear. Now, my question is, how are you going to say you believe in God, but you're fearful at the same time? How are you going to say you believe in the God of the Bible, but at the same time you're afraid of the nation browning? Either you trust God or you trust in your genetics. Which one is it? Asking for a few million black and brown people. You say in God you trust, but at the same time, your actions are causing you to bring detriment to the life of other people. So which one is it? Are you trusting in your genetics, or are you trusting in the God that you say you believe in? You know, the one who's, that keeps you from all hurt and all harm and all danger, the one who has promised to give you long life, the one who's promised to bless your generations. Well, you can't possibly be reading the same scripture that I'm reading, because if your actions are being driven by your fear of genetic annihilation, when God hasn't said anything about annihilating you, so who is driving your fear? Just in case I got some white supremacists looking, I'm just asking the question. Klansmen, white nationalists, what is driving your fear? You say that you believe in God. You say you believe in the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible has promised life, has promised to bless the future generations of the righteous, not the future generations of those who are plotting the demise of other people. So I'm going to need you to get on the right side of your own scriptures. I'm going to need you to get on the right side of your own scriptures that you say you believe in. Follow your own text. Because even your own text doesn't tell you to go around and work out plans of how you can destroy other human beings. Matter of fact, let's go even further. Let's say you don't think black people are human beings. You think that we're of the animal class. Even the scripture talks about how you're supposed to treat animals. None of it says murdering them. Go and read the word of God that you say you believe in. So either way, whether you see us as not human or whether you see us as animals, on both ends, you're wrong. Yep, I'm using your logic today. So either you believe the so-called word you believe in, or you're operating out of your own demonic inspired leanings. Because either way, you're not supposed to be taking out people. You're not supposed to be taking out animals. You're not supposed to be taking out anybody. This is what you say you believe. All right? I've been reading up on Christian identitarians, which most of you are. You're calling yourselves Christians, but you're actually Christian identitarians. And if you missed that broadcast, if you go back a couple of broadcasts on here, either broadcast right up in 25, 26, 27, somewhere in there, I did a broadcast on Christian identitarians, because people keep saying that they're Christians and they're not. They are blending in with the evangelicals. They're blending in with the religious right. They're blending in with the Republican Party, but they are not Christians. They are CNOs, Christians in name only. But their purpose is white supremacist doctrine and agenda. All right. So I want to thank you again for your time and attention. Thank you for giving me a few minutes over. Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness. So please go out today and be light. Take care and see you tomorrow. We'll be talking relationships. God bless.